Today I want to learn more about what's really going on at the US-Mexico border, specifically about this conflict between the National Guard and Federal Border Patrol agents. I was in the National Guard for years. I did a couple of domestic missions after I got back from Iraq, and I find it fascinating that there's this conflict happening between the two in the first place. I got some insight into that, so let's dive into it. So, a tense standoff between Texas National Guard troops and federal government escalated on Tuesday after the state's military said it would hold the line in a battle for control of a stretch of the border with Mexico. A long-running power struggle between the once independent state and the Biden administration was sparked by Texas authorities placing razor wire at a park on the banks of the Rio Grande that has seen high numbers of illegal crossings. Last week, the Texas National Guard blocked federal patrol agents from entering the area in the town of Eagle Pass, accusing them of destroying the fortifications. After being asked by the Biden administration to intervene, the Supreme Court issued an order on Monday allowing for U.S. Border Patrol agents to clear out the razor wire, which should have settled the matter. But on Tuesday, the National Guard issued a blistering statement vowing to protect the sovereignty of our state, and its troops were filmed adding razor wire to the contested area in Eagle Pass. To me, this is fascinating because when I was in the National Guard, obviously the federal level is going to take precedence. They're going to have the authority over you in most situations because the National Guard is attached to the state level. So the Texas Military Department continues to hold the line in Shelby Park to deter and prevent unlawful entry into the state of Texas. We remain resolute in our actions to secure our border, preserve the rule of law, and protect the sovereignty of our state, the Texas National Guard said in a statement. The dispute has transformed a hitherto political battle between Republicans and Democrats into a very real and unprecedented physical standoff between state and federal governments. As of Monday evening, the Texas National Guard was still blocking Border Patrol agents from the area, according to this article by The Independent. The National Guard has really transformed through the global war on terror. It's a completely different organization than it once was. It used to be you go to the National Guard to get out of deploying to Vietnam. But what happened was during the global war on terror, the National Guard was used as like a backdoor draft. They were used as this kind of, so we don't have to do the draft to get civilians to join, we'll just use the National Guard. So they're a lot more powerful than they were before the 2000s. And it's interesting to see they're kind of throwing their weight around here. It's really specifically at this 2.5 mile long section of the border in the city of Eagle Pass. The section includes Shelby Park, which is a 47-acre city park along the Rio Grande named for a Confederate general who fled to Mexico. So that's the border, and Shelby Park is right on the border, and this appears to have been a location where a lot of migrants were trying to pass through safely, probably because the river is probably really low here. So Border Patrol officials had been using this park for processing encountered migrants. Now they're effectively locked out of the park, the Border Patrol agents, and mostly unable to access the heavily crossed border area to do their job. No governor appears to have deployed the state National Guard against federal authorities since 1957, when Arkansas governor sought to block 9 teenagers that were black from entering the all-white Little Rock Center High School under a federal court order, leading President Eisenhower to federalize the state troops. Texas leaders seem eager for a broader fight, arguing that the federal government's failure to respond to what they deem a migrant invasion leaves them no choice but to step in. What a mess. What a mess at the border. I feel awful for the people that are trying to get across. My grandmother was a migrant from Spain during the Spanish Civil War. She was trying to get away from Franco and his forces in Spain that were bombing them. And I also feel for the people in Texas who feel like they're not being listened to. Here's what the situation is. Let's listen to how 60 Minutes put it.
Over the past 3 years, the Biden administration has carried out 4 million expulsions and deportations, more than the Trump administration. But it has also allowed a record 3 million people to remain in the country for years while their immigration cases are heard. And the Border Patrol estimates another 1.6 million people have entered the country illegally without getting caught.
So you're talking about 4 million people, it sounds like, that got here. It's not unreasonable to think that that could cause some problems in the U.S. and there is probably a level of truth to what people are concerned about at the border. I've seen how social services work during hurricane relief, for instance, when I was in the National Guard. their places got to capacity. There's homeless shelters that we were using for people to take shelter in New York City, because there was no electricity. So at a certain point, these type of facilities, they reach capacity. And what starts to happen is people go into crisis mode. They start freaking out. Dangerous actions are taken. Crime starts going up in situations like this. I remember during the hurricane, there weren't enough beds to go around. It took like a day and a half for that logistics to catch up, and for the beds, the supply, the cots, even water to start arriving. Gasoline in the city they were out for days. They didn't have any gas for people to get. The lines were down the road for a mile to get gas for your car. People were telling you every horrible story about how they have to get their mother to the hospital for an appointment, and if she doesn't go, she might die. And you're kind of the gatekeeper to these supplies in the National Guard role, and you have to decide who gets the supplies and who doesn't. And it becomes it's a disaster when there isn't enough, when there's more demand than there are resources. I've seen it happen. It basically always escalates into violence very quickly when there isn't enough to go around. So the article goes on. Texas spent more than $10 billion to deter border crossings. They now intend to build a state military base. And there's already been Florida National Guard members that are patrolling Shelby Park. Other states are promising to help deploy the forces. I read in a different article that apparently there was a private donor who sent $1 million to the National Guard so that they could pull off this mission, that they could send a couple hundred National Guard from, I think it was Arkansas, I forget what state. But to have these states in conflict with the federal government just shows that there's some miscommunication happening here. There's some disconnect between the reality on the ground and what policymakers are doing. So do I know the answers? Do I understand what the government process should be happening right now? No, of course not. I have zero idea, but I want to look into it and understand better what's happening. So if you want to get into the politics of it, this is really where it starts.
Last week, former President Trump visited Shelby Park with Governor Abbott. On the same day, President Biden was also at the Texas border in Brownsville.
Instead of playing politics with the issue, why don't we just get together and get it done?
President Biden says that if Republicans were serious about securing the border, they would not have rejected a bipartisan immigration deal in the Senate last month after former President Trump opposed it. That deal would have increased funding for the Border Patrol and required the president to expel all migrants crossing illegally during surges like the one at Shelby Park in December.
So what they were just saying there, it brings up the idea that there's some politicking going on here, that it's not all about what's the best solution or let's get together and figure this out, solve this problem. A little bit of it could be that both sides of the political spectrum are using this issue as like, let's get one over on the other guys. And really who suffers here are these people who need help at the border, and also the people in New York City, right near me, where they don't have enough supplies to take care of these people. I saw what's happening. I got some family that lives in New York City, and what they're doing is they're taking over hotels, and they're just cramming these people into the hotels. They're paying, I think it's something like $500 a night for some of these families, and it's going through the state budget. And what's happening is the state is having to cut back on things like law enforcement. There's been problems with violence between the police and some of these migrants who are now being thrown out onto the streets because there isn't enough room. They're also keeping them in tents, like tent cities around the city, which really are not, it's not ideal for a family or for people to be set up in for a long period of time. And so in response to this, they're starting what's called Operation Lone Star, which is a joint operation between the Texas Department of Public Safety and the Texas Military Department. The operation started in 2021, and it's ongoing still to today. It's intended to counter the rise in illegal immigration, illegal drug trade, and human smuggling. As we know, there's also a fentanyl crisis at the border. Apparently, they seized 458 million doses of fentanyl with this operation. So that's 10,000 National Guard who are deployed in support of this. The people that support it say that it helped decrease migration in Texas compared to Arizona, New Mexico, and California, for instance. People who are against it say that it hasn't done exactly what it's supposed to do. They say that they've been going after marijuana drug busts and they're not really doing what they claim that they're doing. So you got people on both sides of the aisle, of course, that feel differently about Operation Lone Star. Here's a really interesting part of it that kind of touches on everybody in the country. As part of Operation Lone Star, Texas set up this program where voluntarily to send migrants to sanctuary cities in other states. Typically, they would bus them there. A sanctuary city, my understanding is that it's a city where you have to let these migrants, you have to take care of them to some degree. Abbott stated the purpose of the migrant busing program was to provide Texan border towns with relief from migrant arrivals, which he blames on the Biden administration policies on immigration, and to bring the cost of the border crisis to Democratic cities that had been dismissing it. So basically, he's telling them to put their money where their mouth is. If places like New York City, which is very liberal typically, if they want more migration, then they should be the ones that have to shoulder that burden as well, instead of just the border states. So Abbott mocked leaders of cities that he sent migrants to for saying that they welcome immigrants and that buses provide free rides and food for the migrants, many of whom have expressed gratitude at being able to ride closer to their preferred destinations. Historically, there's a huge immigration community in New York City, for instance, so that's where people are going to be headed anyway. It's where they want to go. I mean, that's where my family immigrated into. So the state reported sending over 100,000 migrants to cities outside Texas and contributed to the New York City migrant housing crisis and other crises in cities like Chicago, Denver, Washington, D.C. Officials in these cities have responded to the drop-off of migrants by deploying emergency measures and calling states for emergencies. And what's the result of this? Basically, officials in areas dealing with the migrant surges have called on Biden and an administration to change immigration policy. They also requested federal aid to fund their response to the migrant influx and reimburse costs. This article by U.S. News, it talks a little bit about, there's so many different theories about why this is happening, who's responsible for it. One of the possible explanations is that the rise in Mexican cartel violence is driving record numbers of migration to the United States. So there's an anecdote about how this specific family is dealing with the violence and having to cross into. Basically, there's this person, her daughter's school shut down after a shootout between rival gangs competing for control of drug and migrant trafficking routes in their southern Mexican town. Then she said produce vendors cleared out of the market after they faced demands to affiliate with the gangs. She feared her husband, Carlos, would be forcibly recruited if he turned up for his job on a construction site. After assassination of a prominent local peace activist, these migrants in Mexico said they had enough, crossing into Arizona with their 4-year-old daughter in early November and turning themselves into the United States Border Patrol agents. It used to be a peaceful town, now everyone is fleeing. So the rivalry between organized crime groups in long, violent states and an expansion of these battlegrounds to previously calm parts of the country is fueling what migration experts are calling the largest exodus of Mexican families in modern history. So this really, I think, gets partly to how you feel about the migrant crisis is going to a little bit come down to, well, who do you think is responsible for it? Do you place the blame at the feet of the United States, for example? Do you feel that it's their fault, that the demand for drugs in the U.S., the demand for cocaine, is the reason why these cartels exist, and that's what's pushing this migration here? Because if you feel that way, I could totally understand why you would feel that it's the United States' responsibility to come up with a solution and to burden the shoulder of the migrants who are coming here. Because if you feel like it's the U.S.'s fault, then they should help, right? But if you feel like it's Mexico's fault that all this is happening, if you think that, well, their government is corrupt and they're not cracking down on the cartels hard enough, then you would feel like, why is it the United States' responsibility to take all these migrants in when really we should have the U.S. military go and destroy all these cartels, or they should work with the Mexican authorities to destroy these cartels? Then there's also other people who feel like it's not about the drug cartels or violence, and that's not why migration is coming here. They feel like it's just for economic opportunity. They feel like these migrants are coming here because they want to earn more money instead of that they're really in fear for their lives. So there's different ways of being in fear for your life, I feel like. If you're so poor that you can't afford to eat, then I think that that is another type of, personally, I feel like that counts as you would need asylum for that. But other people feel differently. And I can understand both perspectives. I get why this is such a polarizing issue. And then there's yet another group of people who feel like the Biden administration only wants migrants to come to the United States because then they'll vote for him in the next election. I mean, we're talking about what they said in that article, in that news clip, like close to 4 million migrants came to the United States. If even just 30% of those people, if they're able to vote for the Biden administration, the election was very close last time, would that tip the scales? So there's these different reasons as to why you might feel one way or the other. I mean, what's happening across Latin America right now is crazy. You got instability in Venezuela, instability in Ecuador, where the gangs there are now taking over because the cartel violence and drug trade is spilling over into Ecuador where it hasn't never been before. So you can see where this stuff does spill over. It can, if you allow it to, it can affect your country because Ecuador was peaceful. They didn't have to worry about anything before 2018. And then since 2018, their murder rate has skyrocketed, become one of the most dangerous places in all of Latin America. And now they're having to take these crazy crackdown efforts of where they have to do what El Salvador did and they have to deploy the military on the street. I do think there's a little bit. One thing that I noticed that I think is interesting is when you see, if you think that the cartels and the gangs are really bad in Mexico, that there's such a terrible, awful problem, then it's kind of hard to also think at the same time, well, these people, they're just coming here for a buck. Like both those things can't be true at the same time, I don't think. Either the cartels are wicked evil and they're in control down there and something needs to be done, or, oh, the cartels are just doing their own thing and these people are trying to come here to make a buck. I'm doing this mainly because I want to get the finger on the pulse to see what people think about all of this. I want to know your comments. What do you think about this clash between federal agents and the National Guard? What do you think the right thing to do is?